Racial bias isn't just a headline, it's a harsh reality that seeps into everyday life, affecting how people interact with one another. Imagine walking through a park, enjoying a sunny day, and suddenly feeling like a target just because of the color of your skin. It's a weight that many carry, often without realizing its impact. Racial bias can turn a simple trip to the store or a day at the park into a nightmare in seconds. Before we continue, please like and subscribe and comment from where you are watching. So what happens when a misunderstanding escalates due to prejudice? What if, in a moment of panic and judgment, someone decides to call the police based on nothing more than a hasty assumption? The consequences can be devastating. An innocent moment can quickly spiral out of control, transforming joy into fear and confusion. In our story, we meet a black mother simply enjoying a day out with her white child. They laugh, play, and bond, completely oblivious to the eyes watching them. But one watchful observer, let's call her Karen, doesn't see a mother and child. Instead, she sees a potential threat, clouded by her biases. In her mind, something doesn't add up, and before she fully understands the situation, she picks up the phone and calls the cops. The impact of that call is immediate. What started as a carefree day shifts into a tense and frightening scenario. The police arrive and suddenly the mother finds herself in a situation she never expected. The very act of enjoying a day out with her child becomes a moment of panic, as she's left wondering how this could happen to her. This is not just a story, it's a reflection of what many people face daily. It reminds us that a few seconds of misunderstanding can lead to life-altering consequences. It's a stark reminder that we must confront our biases and understand the weight of our actions. Join us as we unravel this gripping tale, showing how quickly assumptions can turn into regrets and how a single moment can reshape lives forever. In our story, we have three central characters whose lives collide in a moment that will change everything. First, let's meet Aaliyah, a hardworking black mother in her early 30s. Aaliyah balances her full-time job at a local hospital with raising her bright and energetic 5-year-old son, Ethan. Every day is a juggling act for Aaliyah, filled with the challenges of parenting and the demands of work. She's devoted to creating a loving home for Ethan, teaching him about kindness, resilience, and the importance of standing up for himself. Aaliyah enjoys taking Ethan to the local park every Saturday. It's their special time together, where they can forget about the world's troubles, bond over games, and share laughter. Ethan is a curious child with a big imagination. He loves to play make-believe, often pretending to be superheroes or explorers on grand adventures. His laughter is infectious, lighting up any space he's in. To Aaliyah, these moments at the park are precious, a chance to nurture Ethan's spirit and enjoy life outside the hustle and bustle. Now let's introduce the other character in our story, Karen. Karen is a woman in her late 40s, often perceived as a typical suburban mom. She prides herself on being a diligent member of her community, but she often carries a superiority complex. Karen has a habit of feeling entitled to speak up when she thinks something is wrong, especially when it involves people she believes don't belong. Her judgment can be quick, shaped by stereotypes and assumptions. On this particular Saturday, Aaliyah and Ethan are at the park, happily playing. The sun is shining and children are laughing and running around, but not everyone shares their joy. Karen, sitting on a nearby bench, observes them. At first glance, she sees Aaliyah and Ethan having fun, but a whisper of doubt enters her mind. The sight of a black mother with a white child triggers her biases, and suddenly she feels compelled to intervene. This scenario unfolds in a context filled with racial dynamics that affect daily life. In today's society, racial tensions still run high, and misunderstandings often arise from deep-seated prejudices. People can make snap judgments based on race, leading to significant consequences for those involved. This situation isn't just about a mother and her child. It's about how society views race and the fears that drive people to act without thinking. The local park, where children usually play without a care in the world, becomes the backdrop for this tense encounter. It's a place meant for joy and relaxation, but it quickly shifts into a stage for confrontation. Aaliyah's laughter with Ethan is interrupted by the actions of a woman who sees them through a distorted lens. As Karen decides to call the police, the scene changes dramatically from one of innocence to one filled with uncertainty and anxiety. In this video, we will delve into the unfolding events of that fateful day. We'll follow Aaliyah and Ethan as they navigate the fear and confusion of being wrongfully accused. We'll witness Karen's thought process as she grapples with her own biases and the reality of her actions. The story will reveal how a seemingly innocent day can spiral into chaos due to misunderstanding and prejudice. We'll also explore the aftermath of the incident, discussing how it impacts Aaliyah and Ethan, as well as how Karen's perceptions evolve once confronted with the truth. This narrative is not just a story about one incident. It highlights the need for empathy and understanding in our communities. As we move forward, we'll examine the emotional toll this experience takes on each character. We'll share insights into the broader implications of racial bias and the importance of being aware of our assumptions. By the end of this video, we hope to shed light on the complexities of these situations and inspire a conversation about empathy, understanding, and the power of change. Join us as we unravel this powerful story, showing how assumptions can lead to profound consequences and how it's possible to learn and grow from our mistakes. This is not just a tale of conflict. It's a journey towards understanding and healing in a world that desperately needs it. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon, the kind of day that seemed to beckon families outdoors. Aaliyah and her son, Ethan, were at the local park, ready to enjoy their weekly ritual of fun and laughter. The sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the playground. Children filled the air with squeals of delight, while parents watched from benches nearby, sharing stories and laughter. For Aaliyah and Ethan, this was their happy place, a sanctuary from the busy world outside. As they arrived, Ethan's eyes lit up at the sight of the swings. He dashed towards them, his little legs pumping with excitement. "Mom, look! I want to swing so high!" he exclaimed, grinning from ear to ear. Aaliyah smiled back, her heart swelling with joy at his enthusiasm. She pushed him gently on the swing, each push sending him higher and higher, his laughter ringing through the park. "Higher, Mommy! Higher!" Ethan shouted, his tiny hands gripping the chains tightly. Aaliyah couldn't help but laugh as she pushed him, feeling the weight of her worries lift away with each swing. For that moment, nothing else mattered. They were just a mother and son enjoying a perfect day together. Meanwhile, on a nearby bench sat Karen, observing the scene unfold. She appeared to be just another parent, but as she watched Aaliyah and Ethan, a storm brewed within her. Karen had lived in this neighborhood for years, and her sense of ownership over the park was palpable. She prided herself on knowing everyone and everything that happened in her community. When she spotted Aaliyah, a black mother with her white child, her mind immediately began to race with thoughts fueled by bias and preconceived notions. Why is she with that child? Is he even hers? Karen thought, her face tightening. In her mind, the sight of Aaliyah and Ethan didn't add up. The image clashed with her worldview, and instead of questioning her own assumptions, she felt a surge of indignation. It was a feeling she had felt before, a reflexive judgment that often crept into her thoughts whenever she saw someone she deemed out of place. As she sat there, Karen's discomfort grew. She watched as Aaliyah smiled at Ethan, the joy on their faces contrasting sharply with her own sense of unease. She couldn't help but think, what if something is happening that I can't see? Her thoughts spiraled, and soon she convinced herself that she had to take action. What started as a simple observation morphed into a mission in her mind, a way to protect her community from what she perceived as a threat. Without fully understanding why, Karen picked up her phone. "I need to make sure everything is okay," she muttered to herself, her heart racing. With each second that passed, her anxiety mounted, convincing her that she was justified in her decision. Dialing 911, she felt a sense of empowerment wash over her, believing she was doing the right thing. "911, what's your emergency?" a calm voice answered. Karen's tone was urgent as she explained. "There's a black woman in the park with a white child. I think something's wrong. It doesn't look right." Her words dripped with the assumptions that had formed in her mind, fueled by years of societal conditioning. She had no proof of wrongdoing. She was merely acting on her biases. Meanwhile, Aaliyah remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just a few feet away. She and Ethan had moved on to the sandbox, where they were building a castle. Ethan poured sand into a mold, his little tongue poking out in concentration. "Look, Mommy, it's a castle!" he shouted, beaming with pride. Aaliyah knelt beside him, feeling a wave of love wash over her. She gently brushed a lock of hair from his forehead and said, "It's beautiful, baby. You're a great builder." They were lost in their world, filled with laughter and creativity, completely immersed in their time together. But that joy was about to be shattered. Moments later, the sound of sirens pierced through the park's laughter. Aaliyah looked up, her heart dropping as she saw police cars pull into the parking lot. Her stomach knotted with a mix of confusion and fear. Why were the police here? Was something wrong? As the officers approached, Aaliyah's heart raced. Ethan, sensing his mother's change in mood, stopped playing and looked up at her with wide eyes. "Mommy, what's happening?" he asked, his voice quivering slightly. "It's okay, sweetheart. Just stay close to me," Aaliyah replied, trying to reassure him, even as her own anxiety grew. She stood up, brushing the sand off her hands, her mind racing with questions. Were they here because of her? What could possibly have gone wrong? The police officers approached with a calm demeanor, but Aaliyah could sense the tension in the air. "Ma'am, can we ask you a few questions?" one officer said, glancing over at the other officer, who was looking around, trying to assess the situation. Aaliyah felt a rush of emotions flood over her. Fear, anger, confusion. "What's this about?" she managed to ask, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. The officer explained that they had received a call about a possible disturbance. Aaliyah's heart sank as she realized the call had come from Karen. The moment of joy they had shared just minutes before now felt like a distant memory, replaced by the heavy weight of misunderstanding and judgment. As the police questioned her, Aaliyah felt a wave of vulnerability wash over her. This was not how her day was supposed to go. She was just a mother enjoying a moment with her son, yet here she was, under suspicion, and her child was watching. She glanced at Ethan, who clung to her side, his innocent eyes searching her face for reassurance. In that moment, Aaliyah realized the gravity of the situation. What had started as a simple day at the park had turned into a nightmare fueled by prejudice and fear. The joy that had filled their day had vanished, leaving behind a harsh reality that many families face. A reminder of the biases that still exist in society. As Karen observed from a distance, she felt a mix of triumph and unease. She had made the call, believing she was doing the right thing. But as she watched Aaliyah and Ethan, doubt began to creep in. Did she really see what she thought she saw? Or had her biases clouded her judgment? The park, once a place of laughter, had turned into a scene filled with tension and uncertainty, highlighting the profound impact of misunderstanding and prejudice. The afternoon sun continued to shine, oblivious to the chaos that had just begun to unfold, reminding everyone that in a world filled with assumptions, the truth can sometimes get lost in the noise. The park, once buzzing with the sound of children playing and birds chirping, had an underlying tension brewing. Karen sat on the bench, gripping her phone tightly, her mind racing. Her eyes were fixed on Aaliyah and Ethan. She couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. Her thoughts were a storm of assumptions, biases, and fears. In Karen's mind, the sight of a black woman with a white child triggered suspicions she couldn't ignore. Her heart raced as she dialed 911. The ringing of the phone seemed to echo louder than the children's laughter. She swallowed hard, convincing herself that what she was about to do was justified. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice cut through the noise in Karen's mind. Karen hesitated for a second, but then her fears took over. Her voice was tense, her words rushed. "Yes, I'm at the park, and I think something's wrong. There's a black woman here with a white child. It, it doesn't look right. I think the child might be in danger." The words spilled out quickly, as if by saying them faster, they would carry more weight. Her tone was filled with certainty, but underneath there was a layer of doubt that she was trying to suppress. She didn't know for sure if anything was wrong, but in her mind, the situation didn't add up. Her biases had twisted a normal scene into something suspicious. "Can you describe what's happening?" the dispatcher asked, trying to clarify the situation. Karen's voice became more frantic. "She's just with the kid, but I don't think it's her child. He's white and she's black, and it just looks off. I'm not sure what's happening, but I'm really worried." Can you send someone to check it out? The dispatcher remained calm, trying to gather more information. Is the child in any immediate danger? Karen hesitated again. In truth, there was no visible danger. Ethan wasn't crying, screaming, or acting out. He was just playing in the park like every other child there. But Karen's mind had already made up a story. I don't know, she replied, but I think something's wrong. Please just send someone. It's better to be safe than sorry, right? The dispatcher assured her that officers would be sent to the park to investigate. As Karen hung up, she exhaled, but the knot in her stomach remained. Had she done the right thing? She convinced herself that she had, that it was better to act on her concerns than to let something potentially bad happen. Yet deep down, the unease lingered. While Karen was caught in her thoughts on the other side of the park, Aaliyah was completely unaware of the call that had just been made. She and Ethan were still enjoying their time together. Ethan was now playing on the slide, his laughter echoing in the air as he slid down and rushed back to climb up again. Aaliyah stood nearby, her eyes following Ethan, a smile on her face. This was one of her favorite times of the week, a chance to connect with her son and just be in the moment. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, her world would be turned upside down. As the sound of sirens pierced through the park, Aaliyah's smile faded. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the flashing lights of the police cars pulling up. Panic began to creep in. Why were the police here? What had happened? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Aaliyah's first instinct was to look around for any sign of trouble, but everything seemed normal. The kids were still playing, parents were chatting, and nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Except for the police cars heading in her direction. She felt a wave of dread wash over her as the officers approached. Her heart pounded in her chest. What could they possibly want with her? She quickly glanced at Ethan, who had stopped playing and was now standing by her side, sensing his mother's anxiety. The officers walked up to Aaliyah, their faces serious but calm. "Ma'am, we received a call about a possible situation here," one of them said, glancing down at Ethan and then back at her. "We just need to ask a few questions." Aaliyah's mind was spinning. A situation? What situation? All she had been doing was spending time with her son. Her stomach tightened with fear. She felt her breath quicken, and a surge of protectiveness rose in her chest. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice trembling, despite her efforts to stay calm. The officers explained that someone had called 911, concerned about a black woman with a white child. Aaliyah's heart sank. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Someone had assumed that because she was black and her son was white, something must be wrong. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't about a crime or a threat. This was about the color of her skin. Her fear quickly turned to anger. "This is my son," she said firmly, her voice shaking with emotion. "Ethan is my son. I don't understand why you're here." As Aaliyah stood there, holding Ethan's hand, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless black men and women who had been questioned, detained, or worse, simply because of the color of their skin. It was about the deep-seated biases that still existed in society, causing people like Karen to see her as a threat instead of a mother. Historically, incidents like these have had tragic outcomes. The mere act of calling the police on a black person can escalate into life-threatening situations. There are countless stories where simple misunderstandings have led to devastating consequences because of racial bias. Aaliyah knew this all too well. She had read the headlines, seen the news stories, and now she was living it. The implications of this moment were not lost on her. She was scared, yes, but she was also angry. Angry that her love for her son was being questioned. Angry that her skin color had made her a suspect in someone's eyes. And most of all, angry that this was the reality she had to face as a black woman in America. As the officers realized the misunderstanding, they apologized and left. But the damage had already been done. The experience had shaken Aaliyah to her core. She looked down at Ethan, who had been silent the whole time, and hugged him tightly. This was the world they lived in, and it wasn't fair. Karen from her bench watched the scene unfold. Her initial sense of righteousness began to crumble as she saw the pain and fear in Aaliyah's eyes. In that moment, she realized her mistake, but it was too late. The harm had already been done. As the sirens grew louder, the playful noise of the park slowly faded. People began to notice the flashing lights of the police cars pulling into the lot. Aaliyah stood frozen, watching as two squad cars rolled up, their presence impossible to ignore. Her heart dropped into her stomach. She didn't know what was going on, but she had a sinking feeling that something bad was about to happen. Karen, still sitting on the bench, felt a strange mixture of anxiety and justification. She had made the call, and now the police were here, just as she had requested. Maybe they would confirm her suspicions, or maybe she'd be proven wrong, but she felt like she had done her duty. She watched as the officers got out of their cars, walking toward her first. Their posture was calm, but there was an air of authority that immediately shifted the atmosphere in the park. One of the officers approached Karen, his face neutral. "Are you the one who called 911?" he asked, his tone professional but detached. Karen nodded, her hands gripping her phone tightly in her lap. "Yes, I did. There's a black woman here with a white child, and I thought something wasn't right. I don't know if she's his mother or not, but it didn't look normal to me," she explained, her voice filled with uncertainty now that she was actually saying the words aloud. The officer listened but didn't react with the urgency she expected. Instead, he gave her a short nod and said, "All right, we'll go talk to them. Just sit tight." His partner had already begun walking toward Aaliyah and Ethan. As the officers turned their attention toward Aaliyah, the situation immediately felt more real and terrifying. Aaliyah's mind was racing. What was happening? What had she done wrong? Her heart pounded in her chest as the officers approached, their expressions unreadable. They walked with purpose but not haste, scanning the area as they moved toward her and her son. Ethan, sensing something was off, clung to his mother's leg, his little face filled with confusion. "Mommy, why are the police here?" he asked softly, his voice trembling slightly. Aaliyah forced a smile, trying to mask the fear bubbling up inside her. "It's okay, baby. Just stay close to me," she whispered, stroking his hair to comfort him. The first officer reached them, his tone polite but firm. "Ma'am, we just need to ask you a few questions," he said, glancing between her and Ethan. His partner stood slightly behind him, watching Aaliyah carefully as though waiting for any sign of trouble. Aaliyah felt exposed, like every eye in the park was on her now. Her mouth went dry and her voice was shaky as she replied, "What's this about? Why are you here?" She tried to stay calm for Ethan's sake, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. The officer explained, "We received a call about a potential situation involving a child. Someone was concerned about the welfare of this boy. Can you tell us your relationship to him?" Aaliyah's breath caught in her throat. They thought she wasn't Ethan's mother? The idea seemed so absurd and yet so painful. Her mind flashed through every news story she had read about black parents being questioned about their own children, about how these misunderstandings could escalate so quickly. She felt a wave of vulnerability wash over her. "This is my son," she said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. "His name is Ethan. I'm his mother." The officer nodded but didn't immediately back off. "Can you show us some identification, ma'am? Do you have anything that confirms what you're saying?" Aaliyah felt her face flush with a mix of anger and fear. She knew she shouldn't have to prove her relationship with her own child, but here she was, in the middle of the park, being asked to do just that. Her hands trembled as she reached into her bag, pulling out her wallet. She handed over her ID, which showed her name and photo, but there was nothing that specifically tied her to Ethan. The officer glanced at her ID and then at Ethan, who was now clinging even tighter to his mother, clearly frightened by the whole encounter. "And does he have any identification? A birth certificate or anything like that?" Aaliyah's heart sank. Who carries their child's birth certificate to the park? She shook her head. "No, I don't have anything like that with me. We were just here to play," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The officers exchanged a glance. For a moment, it seemed like the situation could escalate, like Aaliyah's lack of documentation would cast doubt over her claim. The fear in her chest tightened, and she felt a desperate need to protect Ethan from whatever was coming next. She could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her, not just from the officers, but from everyone who had been watching this scene unfold. Aaliyah knelt down to Ethan's level, looking him in the eyes. "Hey, buddy, don't worry, okay? Everything's going to be fine," she whispered, Though her own voice wasn't entirely steady, Ethan nodded, but his wide eyes were filled with confusion and fear. Just as the tension reached its peak, one of the officers finally spoke again. His tone softened, as if he realized the gravity of what was happening. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for the trouble. We just had to respond to the call. It looks like everything's in order here." Aaliyah exhaled deeply, her whole body trembling with the release of tension. But the damage had already been done. She had been made to feel like a criminal in front of her own child, all because someone, Karen, had assumed the worst based on nothing more than her appearance. The fear and anger she felt didn't just vanish with the officer's words. It lingered, wrapping around her like a heavy cloak. As the officers turned to leave, Aaliyah stood up slowly, still holding Ethan close to her. She watched them walk back toward Karen, who was still sitting on the bench, watching everything unfold. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain she had caused, just a lingering sense of superiority. Aaliyah looked around the park, at the parents who had been watching, at the children who were playing again as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The place that had once felt like a safe haven for her and Ethan was now tainted by this experience. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone, despite the fact that the park was full of people. As she gathered Ethan's things and prepared to leave, Aaliyah couldn't shake the feeling that something had been taken from her that day. It wasn't just the time they had lost or the embarrassment she had felt. It was the sense of safety, of belonging, that she and her son had always found in the park. And that, perhaps, was the most painful part of all. As the officers turned their attention away from Aaliyah and Ethan, a shift began to take place. For Karen, it started as a subtle discomfort in the pit of her stomach. She sat on the bench, watching the police talk to Aaliyah, expecting them to confirm her suspicions. But the longer the officers spoke with Aaliyah, the more Karen's sense of certainty wavered. She could see the tension in Aaliyah's posture, the way she protectively held Ethan close. There was no sign of guilt, no attempt to flee or cover up anything. Instead, there was only a mother trying to protect her child. Karen's heart began to race for a different reason now. She started to feel a creeping sense of dread. What if she had been wrong? What if there was nothing wrong at all, and she had called the police on an innocent woman based on nothing more than her own biases? The thought made her stomach churn. The police, having seen no signs of distress or danger, slowly realized that this was a simple case of mistaken assumptions. One officer stepped back, his face showing a flicker of regret. It was becoming clear that Aaliyah was indeed Ethan's mother, and no harm had ever been intended. They had been called here over a situation that had never existed. Karen watched as the truth unfolded before her eyes. She wanted to defend herself, to justify her actions, but the weight of her mistake was settling in. She had acted on a snap judgment, and now the consequences of that judgment were becoming painfully clear. As she sat there, it was impossible to ignore the whispers and glances from the other parkgoers. They had watched the whole scene unfold, and now, instead of focusing on Aaliyah, their eyes were turning toward Karen. A few mothers standing nearby began to murmur quietly among themselves, shaking their heads in disapproval. One woman, pushing her child on a swing, looked directly at Karen, her face twisted in disbelief. "Seriously? You called the cops on a mom just because she doesn't look like her kid?" she muttered, loud enough for Karen to hear. Karen's face flushed with embarrassment. She could feel the weight of judgment bearing down on her from all directions. What had once felt like a justified concern was now unraveling into a scene where she was the one being judged. She had been so sure that she was doing the right thing, but now that certainty was dissolving, replaced by a deep sense of shame. Meanwhile, Aaliyah was standing tall, holding Ethan's hand tightly. The police had backed off, their demeanor softening as they realized the mistake. Aaliyah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was mixed with frustration and anger. She had done nothing wrong, and yet she had been made to feel like a criminal, all because someone had decided that she didn't look like she belonged with her own child. One of the officers, clearly aware of the tension in the air, stepped forward to offer an apology. "Ma'am, we're sorry for the misunderstanding. It looks like everything is in order here," he said, his tone trying to convey sincerity. But Aaliyah wasn't about to let the moment pass without standing her ground. "Sorry?" Aaliyah repeated, her voice calm but filled with emotion. You came here questioning me in front of my son because someone couldn't accept the fact that I'm his mother. This isn't just a misunderstanding. This is about racism. This is about someone making an assumption about me because of the color of my skin. Her words hung in the air, powerful and clear. Ethan looked up at his mother, his eyes wide. Even though he was young, he could sense the importance of what was happening. Aaliyah knelt down beside him, brushing a hand through his hair, her voice softening as she spoke to him. You don't ever have to be ashamed of who you are, okay? Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong. Her words were as much for herself as they were for her son. She needed him to understand, even at this young age, that their bond was strong, and nothing, not even other people's ignorance, could take that away. The people around them began to react. A woman who had been watching from a distance stepped forward, her face full of sympathy. I'm so sorry this happened to you, she said to Aaliyah. It's just not right. You shouldn't have had to go through that. Her words were echoed by a few others who nodded in agreement. It was clear that the crowd was on Aaliyah's side, and Karen could feel the disapproval surrounding her. Karen, still sitting on the bench, looked down at her hands. The reality of her actions was sinking in deeper now. She had let her biases lead her to make a terrible mistake, and now everyone around her knew it. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself, but she couldn't find the words. What could she say? That she had acted out of fear? That she hadn't meant for things to go this far? None of it seemed like enough. Aaliyah, on the other hand, was standing her ground. She refused to be passive in this moment. You need to understand that what you did was wrong, Aaliyah said, looking directly at Karen now. You called the police on me because of how I look. You didn't ask questions. You didn't stop to think. You just assumed the worst. Do you know what could have happened? Do you understand the danger you put me in? My son? Karen felt a lump form in her throat. She nodded, but it was clear that words weren't going to fix this. She had acted out of prejudice, and now she had to face the consequences of that choice. The officers, seeing that the situation was diffusing, gave a final apology to Aaliyah before leaving the park. As they walked away, the crowd's attention shifted fully to Karen. Some people shook their heads in disapproval, while others simply stared in silence. The weight of their judgment hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. For Aaliyah, though, the moment had shifted. What had begun as a terrifying encounter had turned into a powerful stand for her dignity and her family. She had faced adversity, but she hadn't backed down. She had shown Ethan and everyone around her what it meant to stay strong in the face of injustice. As the sun began to set, Aaliyah gathered her things, holding Ethan's hand tightly as they walked away from the park. She knew that this wasn't the last time they would face challenges like this, but today she had stood tall. She had fought back against the ignorance and fear that still permeated society. And though the experience had been painful, she knew that she had left the park stronger than when she had arrived. Karen remained on the bench, alone with her thoughts, reflecting on the harm she had caused. The lesson was one she wouldn't soon forget. As the police wrapped up their investigation, it became clear that no crime had been committed. The officers, now understanding that the situation was nothing more than a misunderstanding fueled by assumptions, approached Aaliyah one last time. The lead officer, the one who had asked her for identification, took a deep breath before speaking. Ma'am, we're sorry for the confusion. It's clear now that there was no threat here, just a miscommunication. His words were professional, but there was an underlying tone of discomfort. He knew they had overstepped, and he was trying to offer some semblance of an apology without fully acknowledging the deeper issue. Aaliyah stood tall, still holding Ethan's hand. She nodded slightly but remained silent for a moment, letting the weight of what had just happened sink in. She had just been made to prove her motherhood, her love for her son questioned because of someone else's bias. The fact that it had all come down to a miscommunication felt like an insult. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a reflection of a much bigger problem. Aaliyah finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. I understand you have a job to do, but this was more than just a misunderstanding. This was about the fact that someone looked at me and decided that I didn't belong with my own child. I hope you realize the damage that's been done today. Her eyes met the officer's, and he looked down, unable to maintain the gaze. He nodded, clearly unsure of what more to say. We're truly sorry, he repeated, but even he knew those words weren't enough. Karen, still sitting on the bench, watched the exchange with a sinking feeling in her chest. The reality of her actions was becoming harder to ignore with each passing moment. She had called the police thinking she was protecting a child, but in reality, all she had done was hurt an innocent mother and her son. The weight of that realization pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. In a moment of desperation, Karen stood up and approached Aaliyah and the officers. Her hands fidgeted nervously, her face flushed with embarrassment. I, I'm so sorry, she stammered, her voice trembling. I thought something was wrong. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just, when I saw you with your son, I thought maybe. Her voice trailed off as she realized there were no words that could fully justify what she had done. Aaliyah turned to face Karen, her expression unreadable. For a moment, the two women stood in silence, the weight of the situation hanging heavily between them. Karen, desperate to explain herself, continued, I was worried about the boy. I didn't think, I just didn't think. Aaliyah's eyes flashed with a mix of emotions, anger, frustration, sadness. But beneath all of that, there was something else, exhaustion. She had heard variations of Karen's apology before, from other people who had acted out of ignorance, fear, or bias. It was a familiar refrain, one that always seemed to miss the deeper point. You didn't think, Aaliyah repeated, her voice steady but full of meaning. That's the problem. You didn't think before you called the police. You didn't stop to ask yourself if maybe, just maybe, your assumptions were wrong. Instead, you put me and my son in danger because of your fear. Do you have any idea what could have happened today? Karen swallowed hard, her eyes welling up with tears. I'm sorry, she whispered again, but Aaliyah wasn't finished. This isn't just about today. It's about what people like me have to deal with every day. We get judged, questioned, and assumed guilty before we've even said a word. Do you understand that? Do you understand what you put me through? What you put my son through? Aaliyah's voice cracked slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. She refused to let her emotions be mistaken for weakness. Karen could only nod, tears slipping down her cheeks. She hadn't considered the full impact of her actions. In her mind, she had been trying to protect, but now she saw the harm she had caused. I'm so sorry, she said again, but even she knew that sorry wasn't enough. Aaliyah looked at Karen, and for a brief moment, she felt a flicker of something close to pity. Karen was a product of the same system that had created this moment, a system built on fear, suspicion, and deep-seated biases. But that didn't excuse what she had done. The damage was real, and the pain was lasting. You need to do better, Aaliyah said quietly, but her words were filled with power. You need to think before you act, because next time, someone might not be as lucky as I was today. Karen nodded again, unable to speak. She wiped her tears away, feeling utterly exposed and ashamed. The officers, still standing nearby, exchanged awkward glances, clearly unsure of how to proceed. They had apologized, and the situation had been resolved, but the tension in the air remained thick. Aaliyah took a deep breath, glancing down at Ethan, who was still clutching her hand. She could feel his confusion, his fear. She knelt down, looking him in the eye. Are you okay, baby? She asked softly, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. Ethan nodded slowly, but his little face was serious. Mommy, why did the lady think you weren't my mom? He asked, his voice full of innocent confusion. Aaliyah's heart ached at his question. How could she explain all of this to a 5-year-old? How could she make him understand the complicated, painful truth about the world they lived in? She swallowed hard, searching for the right words. Sometimes people make mistakes, Ethan. They see things and don't understand. But you and I, we know the truth. I'm your mommy and nothing will ever change that. Ethan nodded again, this time with more certainty, and Aaliyah felt a wave of relief wash over her. They would get through this, just like they always had. But she knew the road ahead would still be filled with moments like these, moments where they would have to confront the ignorance and fear of others. As Aaliyah stood up, she turned to the officers one last time. I appreciate your apology, but I hope you understand what happened here today. This isn't just about one phone call. It's about a system that lets people like me get questioned, suspected, and targeted just for existing. I hope you think about that the next time you get a call like this. And experiences in the comments below.